It was early in the morning, just as the sun was rising, when Red Star and Bull descended from the butte. By that time, the entire army had assembled, and the mule train had joined them. Custer ordered all the scouts to gather around him, forming a circle. He addressed them, saying, "I want to make my intentions clear the way I see it. We're going to charge together, and once we reach the Sioux camp, I want you to scatter as many horses as you can." With that, the charge toward the Dakota camp commenced. They covered 3 or 4 miles before Custer climbed the high butte, only to descend after observing the Dakota camp. The scouts led the charge, reaching the solitary teepee around noon. The distance from the high butte to the lone teepee was roughly the same as from there to the Little Bighorn. They arrived at the Dakota camp just before 3 o'clock, riding swiftly, with Custer and Little Sioux positioned near the middle. Upon reaching the river, Custer noticed Young Hawk, Strikes 2, Boy Chief, and Goose climbing the opposite bank. As he ascended the bank, he saw before him a broad, curved stretch of land covered in sagebrush, with timber to the right. The soldiers were forming a line perpendicular to the timber, and soon the gunfire began. Just in front of the soldiers, Little Sioux, not far from the bank, spotted Black Fox and Forked Horn. To the left, near some buttes, he also noticed Bobtailed Bull. Some Dakotas were riding between Bobtailed Bull and the soldiers. Little Sioux was about halfway to the line of soldiers, surrounded by others, when he saw Bloody Knife emerge from the timber, driving 3 horses from the direction of the Dakota camp. Bloody Knife, who was his uncle, approached him and said, "Take these horses back. This is what Custer told us to do." Little Sioux ignored him, and Bloody Knife turned back without waiting to see what happened with the horses. Along with Little Sioux were Red Star, Strikes 2, and Boy Chief. As they stood together, watching across the river, they saw 3 women and 2 children at the foot of the ridge, where they were to cross later, hurrying across the flat toward the river. Little Sioux fired twice at them, as did Red Star. Then all 4 scouts rode through the timber toward the river to kill them. But at that moment, they spotted a large herd of about 200 Dakota horses grazing in the sagebrush across the river, so they stopped chasing the women and children and turned their attention to the horses. Little Sioux had no trouble crossing either bank, riding his horse through the water. On the opposite side, there was dense sagebrush and willows, and the 4 of them crossed together. They began driving the horses upstream. Red Star rode farthest left, followed by Boy Chief, Strikes 2, and lastly, Little Sioux. As they drove the horses, Little Sioux spotted the tops of Dakota teepees about 3/4 of a mile away across the river. They had ridden farther downstream than the soldiers' battle line to intercept and drive the horses back away from the Dakotas. They had barely started heading the horses when the Dakotas crossed the river from the village where Little Sioux had seen the teepee tops. A running fight began up the valley, lasting over a mile, with the Dakotas chasing and firing at them. They reached and crossed a high bluff where the fighting was fiercest, and the Dakotas pursued them for 7 or 8 miles. The struggle for the horses continued until nearly dark, or until the red flashes from the guns were visible. By this time, only 5 Dakotas remained. These appeared to have circled in front of the herd, attacking the scouts as they passed. The flat between the ridge and the river was about 3/4 of a mile wide, and the scouts drove the horses closer to the river than the ridge. They crossed the ridge because it curved ahead of them without deviating from their course. The crossing point was a mile below the first crossing and about 3/4 of a mile from the second. The 2 river crossings Little Sioux made were about a mile apart. While driving the horses on the flat, Little Sioux could clearly hear the battle raging on both his right and left, and slightly behind him he heard another battle, though it was less distinct. As he ascended the ridge, he met the other scouts who had been left behind, and together they continued onward. From the ridge he saw that the battle was over, with dead soldiers and horses scattered from the battle line all the way to the river, and even on the bank and up to the hill. They rode on, and looking back, they saw dismounted soldiers who had straggled up from the river, fighting the Dakotas back. Little Sioux saw a dead soldier lying just where he had crossed the ridge onto the hill. His horse, the one he had ridden from the start, was spent. Ahead of the other scouts, he noticed a black horse with a piece of buckskin around its neck, from which a bell hung. He dismounted, captured the Dakota horse, saddled it with his own gear, and let his original horse go free, all while riding up the hill. As he glanced back toward the battleground, he also looked toward where he had heard firing to his left. There, about 2 miles to the west, along a ridge, he saw a steep hill covered with Dakota horsemen, swarming like ants, riding all around. At the top, some soldiers were lying down, shooting at the Dakotas, who were firing back. Little Sioux noticed several small fires on the prairie where the first fighting had occurred, with much smoke but no visible blaze. He also saw groups of Indians on the southern hill, moving off in various directions, scattering as they climbed higher, about 3 miles away. On the battleground, he saw Dakotas riding among the dead, shooting at them. The last Dakota attack on the scouts who were driving the herd had involved 5 Dakotas. Stabbed ordered some of them to dismount and hold back the enemy. Those who stopped were Little Sioux, Soldier, Strikes 2, Boy Chief, Stabbed, and Strikes the Lodge. When the 4 scouts met up with the others at the hilltop, some of them remained behind to fend off the Dakotas. These were Soldier, Little Sioux, Stabbed, Strikes the Lodge, Strikes 2, and Boy Chief. They fought on foot to hold back the Dakotas, who had by then already killed all the dismounted soldiers. Their horses were fastened to their cartridge belts by a loose slipknot, and when riding, the rope hung in a coil on the saddle horn. This was a common practice among all the Indians to ensure they never lost their horses in battle. After this group of scouts managed to stop the Dakotas and drive them back, it was about an hour before sunset. They attempted to find the herd but lost their way for a while. In the previous skirmish with the 5 Dakotas, the herd was so close that the gunfire frightened the horses, and despite the scouts' efforts, the entire herd was lost. Little Sioux now fell back with the other 5 scouts, believing that all the soldiers had been killed and all the horses lost. Stabbed rode his horse and a mule, which he had taken from the large herd when the scouts first encountered him. They rode through the night and the next day without stopping, reaching the area where the steamboat unloaded by evening. There they found some stale crackers and made camp to rest and eat. While they were camped, they were spotted by a party led by Running Wolf, who mistook them for Dakotas. After sunrise the following day, Black Fox joined them. Upon seeing him in the distance, Little Sioux was sent to meet him and called out that he was an Arikara. However, Black Fox couldn't hear him due to the wind blowing toward him, and he assumed it was a Dakota party. Black Fox dismounted from the Dakota horse he was riding, leaving the saddle behind, and mounted his own bareback. He rode into a blind washout with steep banks, but there he heard Little Sioux's voice echoing back from the high bank. Recognizing him, he rode out again, glad to see Little Sioux, and gave him the horse he had captured. The 6 scouts slept under the roots of a fallen tree with a fire going. They were cooking some camp leftovers when Black Fox appeared from a long distance around 8 o'clock. The 7 scouts traveled all day and camped at the mouth of Tongue River, where they rested overnight. The following day, they arrived at the Powder River Base Camp, just as the bugles were sounding for dinner. Some soldiers met them, and they reported what had happened, but the soldiers didn't believe them. The commanding officer then called them in, and the scouts told him everything they knew. He said nothing when they finished and sent them out again. In camp, they found 4 other scouts, Horns in front, Charata, and 2 others. About 3 days later, the commanding officer ordered them to bring their horses up for inspection, as mail needed to be carried. However, the horses were too worn out, so 2 mules were used instead. He sent the mail out with 2 scouts, Crow Bear and a half-breed, to General Terry on the Bighorn River. By this time, no other scouts had arrived yet. Before they reached Terry's camp, the steamboat arrived with the wounded. Until the boat's arrival, 7 scouts were still missing, 3 who had been killed, 3 with young Hawk, and the interpreter, Fred Gerard. The steamboat took the scouts across the river, about 24 of them, and they traveled upriver to meet the Crow Indians, who had gathered too late to assist Custer at the mouth of the Rosebud. They crossed the Elk River again by steamboat, which continued with them upriver. They marched along the east bank of the river, where they met some soldiers, and later encountered other soldiers with Arapahoes. All of these groups were meant to join Custer's forces against the Dakotas, but it was now too late. When the Arapaho Indians approached, the soldiers initially mistook them for Dakotas and prepared to fight. The Arapahoes explained to the scouts that the battle plan had been devised for after all the soldiers had assembled, but Custer had launched his attack too soon.